with no further ado, you already know who this is. This is Dr. Smith. We've had one before, and today he's going to do a lecture on the strange career of Jim Crow. So,
good morning. Good morning. I am so happy to be back. And like I said before, I very much enjoy getting to walk out of my lane and go over something that I haven't gone over in a while and something that's new. I like teaching Civ 1 and Civ 2, but there's only so many times you can kill Louis XVI and have fun with it, right? Mr. Baker knows about that one. So getting to talk about something a little bit more in my wheelhouse is always great. What I want to start with is actually a brief discussion of historiography, because you can't understand how segregation is understood and interpreted without understanding what historiography itself is. Because you see, historiography is the professional study of history, just like geography is the special study of, is the professional study of spatial data, or psychology is the study of the human mind. Historiography is the study of history. And if you wonder why history books keep getting written over and over again, why do historians write about the same events time and time again? A large part of it has to do with each generation interprets history from its own perspective. Each generation will look at the exact same events, but come up with a different idea of what the motivations were, or why events turned out as they did. And you better believe that when we talk about bringing Africans to the New World and their role in the New World and everything from slavery to the civil rights movement to segregation and everything else, there are many different interpretations and questions that we have to explore. And that's part of what we will be doing today. And the reality is, historians embrace different schools of thought. Historians will tend to get into a certain lane, and everything that they write about will fit within a certain context. For example, during the Cold War, historians tended to write with what we would call the consensus school, and Mr. Baker knows about the consensus school. In very simple terms, most American history involved downplaying the conflicts. We Americans are really all kind of one people. We're more alike than different. The conflicts that we've had were always something that we overcame. Hooray for America. And this made a lot of sense during the Cold War, because we are opposed to the evil communist Soviet Union, and so all being together in one country looks good, and so we're writing history from that perspective. And during the 60s and 70s, the New Left movement started to emerge, and the New Left movement takes an emphasis on major historic events taking place from the non-old white man crowd. Right, the American Revolution, they start emphasizing all the people that weren't George Washington and Ben Franklin and the roles that they played, and so on and so forth. And there's many different schools, so to say. So we have to keep that in mind. And I know that it gets complex, but I am going somewhere with this. It is important to understand, first and foremost, when we talk about bringing Africans to North America and then enslaving them, this has always been controversial, meaning that at the very time that this started happening, there were a lot of people that were quite uncomfortable with this. The myriad of questions around the morality of this, the logistics of this, why are we really doing it to these people? This is definitely debated almost from day one. And critically to that, we need to understand that there was no fixed plan for the creation of slavery in the New World. There was no fixed plan for the role that the children of Africa will play when they are put in a society that is being colonized by Europeans, taking land from Native Americans, so on and so forth. It's not as if the leaders just sat down and decided, okay, this is exactly what we're going to do. The truth of the matter is, it just kind of evolved. There were people that absolutely did not want to see slavery of any kind, and they thought that it was immoral. They thought that it was very much against the idea of building a Christian society for a wide range of reasons. Pennsylvania, for example, was a colony that, even though it did have slavery for a while, slavery was deeply unpopular. The Quakers in Pennsylvania never wanted it. They thought it was a bad thing. As we probably also know, when these individuals came, and we talked about before, we already know most of them were Afro-Caribbeans, most of them were not actually directly from Africa. They weren't always slaves when they showed up. You know, a lot of them were indentured servants. Some of them even came over as free individuals, although not many. And slavery just kind of evolved. Over the few decades of the 17th century, they went from being primarily indentured servants to being primarily enslaved, depending on the colony that we're with. The first actual colony to legalize slavery was in 1641. That was Massachusetts. But you have to write that down. We're just talking. But just know, no fixed plan, plenty of controversy. Exactly what role will they play in society? What role will they play alongside white people? Will race even be a factor? Because as everybody knows, when you get humans together, humans do what humans do. And when the lights go down, all bets are off. And so in a few generations, maybe we're not even going to be different races. Who knows? Who really knows? Now, when it comes to historic schools, when it comes to the way we choose to interpret history, I tend to follow what is called the progressive school. And there are certainly those that don't have to, but I tend to follow the progressive school. And the progressive school argues that most human action is economic based. Most human action is about profit, about money, so on and so forth. This was a school that isn't especially popular today, but it was popular well over 100 years ago. And simply put, people act in their own economic self-interest. And if you look at any major movement or major action by humans, follow the money and you're probably going to get your answer. That's the easiest way to put the progressive school. If you look at the American Revolution, what was really motivating our founding fathers and the American patriots to rebel against the crown? It was about money. Okay, they decided that at the end of the day, we could make more money as an independent country than as a colony of England. So that's Britain. That's why they did it. It wasn't about freedom and patriotism. It was about cash. If you look at why we colonized the New World, so on and so forth. So if we apply that to the role of the African people in the New World, it raises a few questions. And I will be the first to say, my interpretation that if you follow the money and you get your answer, my interpretation there might not be right. And there are plenty of people that disagree. There are very strong arguments against it. So we're going to explore that. And like I said, we are getting somewhere. Here's the question that I want you to think about, okay? Once African people or Afro-Caribbean people, black people, the children of Africa, pick a term, once they are in North America, why were they kept enslaved for so long? Why did it go on for so long despite the very obvious problems with slavery? And of course, the moral issue is really only one of them. And even after emancipation, why were they second-class citizens for roughly another 100 years? Why did that take place for so long? What was the motivation that the people in power had to do this? Because one thing is certain. As we know, this is deeply controversial from day one. There are very loud, very intelligent voices arguing that this institution of treating these people as a lesser class of human is something that we absolutely shouldn't do. And you can just, you can just read any type of moral thesis and it's going to say we're supposed to treat people equally and we're not doing it. So here's argument number one. Here's argument number one that some people are going to make. And it's the argument that we are all, of course, perfectly familiar with and perfectly disturbed by: white supremacy, general bigotry. Just an understood belief among the powers that be that these individuals who are either Africans or most likely ancestors of Africans, again, black people, are just inferior people. They have an inferior culture, they are, intellectually inferior, so on and so forth. And as such, giving them the same rights that the white people would have would be bad for society. They are not capable of interacting in Western culture in a way that would be positive and constructive. If we free them, if we make them equal, society will fall apart. They will be criminally minded, they will be, they won't pay taxes, they won't become literate, so on and so forth. They'll just be bad citizens. And so keeping them enslaved is a form of social control. It is a way of making sure that these people don't cause all the problems that are associated with their race. And we hear this argument from the day the first one stepped off the boat all the way up, I suppose, until the present, because we know that racism and bigotry, unfortunately, still hasn't gone away. Everyone in here understands that argument. We don't agree with the argument, certainly, but we understand that that argument has been made for a very, very long time. But remember, historians have different schools. We look at things from a different perspective. There's problems with that. And the most obvious problem with that is there are more than enough examples of these individuals doing just fine in Western civilization. There's more than enough examples of them becoming literate, of them becoming educated, of them becoming perfectly normal, nice people, and especially during an era where 90+% of everybody is farmers. What's really the difference? You know, what's really the difference between a black farmer and a white farmer? You're not going to find much of one, and we'll get back to that in a minute. And so, if you're going to argue the bigotry argument, well, these people are putting an awful lot of effort into maintaining something that really doesn't hold a lot of water. So let's make argument number 2. Why these individuals were enslaved and then later treated as second-class citizens, and let's go to the progressive school. Ladies and gentlemen, it's all about the money. That's it. It's all about the money. The real reason, and here's an image here of, you know, early anti-slave literature, you know, early anti-slave individuals, a lot of religious leaders, just a lot of good people, et cetera, are saying we don't need slavery, this is wrong, on a number of levels that were, you know, vocal from very early on. And I hope we're familiar with the abolition movement that emerged after 1831, where they got extremely vocal. So again, why are we keeping this institution around when it is so controversial and so difficult? But how about we say that it's all about the money? How about we say that at the end of the day, the real reason has nothing to do with bigotry, right? It has everything to do with somebody wants to make money off these people's labor, and by keeping them enslaved, you make money off of them. Now, if you embrace that argument, if you say, you know, the slave owners, we're just going for the money here, maybe we also have to say that maybe these people weren't nearly as bigoted as we think. Maybe these people weren't really all that racist. They were just simply using that as a justification to make money. Maybe at the end of the day, everybody knew that the arguments of black inferiority are hot air, and it is just a mechanism to exploit their labor. I want this guy to work for me, and I want to make as much out of him as possible. So what I'm going to do is come up with a reason to do it. And he has dark skin, that means he's inferior. That's the excuse. And bigotry is really nothing more than an excuse. But of course, this has holes in it too. There's problems with this argument. Oh, yes?
Can it be both? Can it be
well,
both?
You see, I would say that, and we could make both arguments, and we're certainly going to argue that there's plenty of bigotry and there's plenty of attempts to make money. But what I'll say is this. We kind of have to come up with a foundation for historiography itself, right? If we're going to be historians, what we want to do is effectively say this is the lane that I tend to go into when I make my historic arguments. So if I'm going to make the progressive argument that slavery and involuntary servitude was financially based, I also kind of look at the American Revolution that way. I also look at the War of 1812 that way. You see what I'm saying, right? And so in order to have a consistent thesis as a historian, you kind of have to know where you stand, right? Think of it like your political ideology, right? In order to have a political ideology, you have to be consistent. You see what I'm saying? Somebody who says, I'm going to vote one way one day and I'm going to vote another way the next, isn't really thinking that much, right? It's okay to have a different opinion, but you got to pick one. You see what I mean? So I understand exactly what you're saying, but what would we say is the primary motivator? How about that? It's both, but which matters more, right? Which matters more, the bigotry or the money? Which would you say is the real, is the stronger of the two? How about we go there? Now, the economic argument has some pretty big flaws. And one of the very big flaws is we absolutely know there was plenty of bigotry going around, right? There's absolutely no question about that. We see it in people that certainly have no economic motive to feel this way, but yet they do. But there's another serious flaw with the economic argument, and we'll start with slavery. Slave owners insisted, before emancipation, and boy, they got loud about this during the antebellum era. Boy, they got loud about it. That slavery wasn't really all that profitable. I don't really make that much money as a result of being a slave owner. You know, the planter class would argue that, you know, at the end of the day, when you own people as slaves, you have to feed them, you have to house them, you have to clothe them, you have to give them medical care, you have to take care of them when they become old and unable to work. Slavery is actually, there's a pretty big bill associated with this. And so yes, we are making money off of their labor, and that money is offset by the work that they're doing. And so, the planters would argue, if we really wanted to make money, if this was all about the money, we'd free all of our slaves and then just hire them as free labor, right? They can be free people, the moral argument is gone, but of course then they would be in charge of taking care of their own expenses, right? They have to feed and clothe themselves, they have to get their own houses whenever they can't work. Well, they're on their own now, right? But who's right? And when, and believe me, historians have studied this, they have crunched the numbers for years, it turns out that the planters were probably correct. If you actually look at what it cost to maintain an antebellum slave system, and then you look at the amount of money you can make if you just free everybody and hire free labor, you're probably going to make more money with free labor. You're probably going to make more money that way. Now, individual planters certainly became very wealthy, but the economy as a whole is almost generally understood now. Slavery was bad for the economy. It was bad for the economy. Emancipation would have brought much more money into the economy. Emancipation would have raised everybody's wealth, including the former slave owners. If we're just looking at the money, slavery makes no sense. Slavery makes no sense whatsoever. And one thing these slave owners were businessmen. Okay, one thing that they liked doing was making money. So is slavery really all about the money? Is keeping these people second class really all about the money, or is it back to the bigotry argument? These people are just a bunch of racists and they don't want black people to be free, right? Because there you go. Now, here's one factor to keep in mind. Here's one factor to keep in mind. Slavery was not all about the money just for the slave owner. There were an awful lot more people making money off of this industry. Insurance companies up in the north made tremendous amounts of money for life insurance policy on slaves. There were slave traders and slave brokers, cotton brokers, factories. Slavery was making money for a lot of people, not just the person owning the slave, so that kind of gets back to the economic argument. But then we have to ask ourselves, why is the emancipation movement growing in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, while at the same time they understand that this is bad? And yes, we are getting to segregation, so just bear with me. We fought an entire war in the South to preserve slavery. Thousands and thousands of Southern white men were willing to die rather than accept the fact that slavery has to come to an end. So there is some serious emotional investment in maintaining the status quo. Is it bigotry? Is it money? Let's look at white society. Let's look at white society in the 1800s. Not all white people are the same, folks. There are different classes in white society. There's different groups that are represented in white culture, okay? There are, of course, planters. The wealthy plantation elite, almost all of them are slave owners. Pretty much all of them are. They are the leaders in society. They are respected in society. They think that they are better than everybody, including other whites. They are the ones that serve in Congress. They are the ones that send their sons to military academies, so on and so forth. There are a small number, very small number of bourgeoisie, educated professionals, doctors, lawyers, people like that, that generally we would put within the planter class in terms of how they view the world. Then we have yeoman farmers, old McDonald types. You know, the fellow who has 40 acres and a small farmhouse and lives on his own. Some of these own slaves, some of them didn't own slaves. They firmly defended the system of slavery and the system of what we will call second-class status for non-whites, even though these are not wealthy people, and generally speaking, they're not making all that much money off of enslavement. Now again, some of them owned slaves and some didn't. They made up the rank and file of the Confederate soldiers during the war and were willing to die by the thousands to make sure that slavery did not come to an end. They became even more aggressive about it after the Emancipation Proclamation. So think about that for a minute. Then, of course, we have white trash, the low-class whites. the people who don't own land, who are ignorant, unsophisticated, they are beneath the yeoman. They are beneath the yeoman. These are the people that the blacks would call crackers, the no good peckerwoods that don't own land and are just, ignorant. Yeah, we all know those terms. We know who we're talking about. We know who we're talking about. So, in the 1950s, a historian comes along named C. Van Woodward. A historian comes along named C. Van Woodward, and he is deeply interested in why, decades after emancipation, and decades after the Constitution was changed, guaranteeing equality in the very foundation of our government itself, why are these individuals still second class? What's going on? Because you see, you can't make the economic argument for slavery anymore. Slavery ended. Slavery is long gone. But yet we are still holding on in society to this notion that there is a difference, between the races, and we're segregating ourselves, and one group is quote unquote better than the other. And these, of course, we will collectively call Jim Crow laws. And Woodward was particularly interested in this because he's writing about this in the 1950s. And in 1954, he writes the book that I'll refer to in a minute. And it's called The Strange Career of Jim Crow. And he's exploring this issue. And in 1954, segregation is now breaking down. Brown versus Board of Education was ruled on just a year earlier. We are starting to see the emergence of what another historian will call the rise of mass resistance, young black people refusing to cooperate with these laws, demands for equality that are actually gaining traction on the ground. And he notes in the book, this is breaking down regardless of what you think about it. So what's going on? The Montgomery bus boycott is 1954, same year this book comes out. This book was so groundbreaking, Martin Luther King called it the historic Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. That's how important this book was, and it was a massive seller when it came out. So the question then is, why Jim Crow? Why are these laws in place? Is it bigotry, or is it economic? Maybe, just maybe, there's an economic argument for this. Maybe somebody's making money, because you see, again, if you follow the progressive school, your logic is the major movements in American society are going to ultimately be governed by money. People act in their own economic self-interest. Well, certainly the emergence of racism and segregation is a major movement. And you see, this becomes even more perplexing because to any rational mind, segregation, racial segregation as it was understood in the 20th century, it's kind of dumb. And again, it doesn't matter what your view of race is in this country. The reality is implementing a policy that segregates people based on race or perceived race is just a dumb way to run a society. It's a lot more expensive. It's a lot more of a hassle. It's just illogical to have a bathroom for one race of people and a bathroom for another. It is illogical to force one group of people to sit on the back of a bus. It costs a lot more money, and it's certainly a lot more complex to try to have a school system for one group of people and a school system for another group of people, when in reality, all school kids are the same age. It'd make a lot more sense to just send every kid to the same school, wouldn't it? And so it doesn't make sense that this is such an important issue. So something is motivating people, and he wants to know why. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's the progressive argument. Maybe it isn't just basic bigotry and racism. So he looks at this a little bit more closely, and he figures one thing out that up to that point nobody had thought about. And that is, racial segregation didn't exist before emancipation. It didn't. Racial segregation did not exist before emancipation. Black people and white people lived in the same place, didn't they? If you are a plantation owner and you have your slaves, they live where you live, don't they? Now, they live in slave cabins and you live in the big house, but you're on the same land.
Okay.
Right? They went to church together. Same church. Right?
Oh.
Churches became far more segregated after emancipation than before. Right? Basically, they ate the same food, listened to the same music, when it really gets down to it, if you look at society, in a society that is 90+% agricultural, everybody lived among each other. Everybody lived among each other, and there really isn't all that much difference culturally between your typical yeoman white farmer and your typical poor black farmer. And that's an important point to make next. What were slaves? If you don't use the word slave to describe them, they're just farmers, aren't they? That's all they are. Everybody, no matter what your color is or where your ancestors came from, I guarantee you your ancestors were farmers. That's what they were, farmers. 90+% of everybody were farmers. One group of farmers gets to keep the profits from their crops. One group of farmers obviously didn't, but they're all farmers. They're all farmers. Maybe white people and black people are an awful lot more alike during the era of slavery. And it is just racial slavery that maintains that social hierarchy. All slaves were poor farmers. That's all they were. Poor farmers who didn't get to profit from their crop and didn't get to move up. What happened during the Civil War? See, the South fights the Civil War. The South loses, and loses badly. Thousands and thousands of Southern men, white Southern men, of course, black Southern men didn't fight in the war. Thousands and thousands of young white Southern men are killed, are wounded, etc. And we just pointed out who made up the rank and file of the Southern armies? Yeoman farmers, right? Not poor white trash. It was primarily yeoman farmers, just ordinary poor farmers that fought that war and lost very, very badly. And the South was devastated as a result of the war. Absolutely devastated. The entire economy was crushed. Cities were burned to the ground. Infrastructure destroyed. The war was absolutely apocalyptic to the South. There are three, you don't have to write this down, three utterly boneheaded military decisions that have been made in the modern era that you just cannot believe anyone was stupid enough to make. One of which was the attack on Fort Sumter that the South used to start the Civil War. The other was unrestricted submarine warfare that Germany did in 1917. And of course, who can tell me what the third one was? How about the bombing of Pearl Harbor? Right? Because I guarantee you, the Japanese made a big mistake when they bombed Pearl Harbor. I mean, you know, in all three cases, a much weaker group of people decided to pick a fight with a much stronger group of people, and it ended up very, very badly. So, what happens? The war is over, and Southern society is bankrupted. Now, Southern planters, the plantation elite, these people, what do they want to do when the war ends? Well, they want to get back to making money, don't they? Remember, we're looking at an economic argument here. We're looking at an economy. They want to get back to making money. They want to get back to growing primarily cotton or tobacco and selling it and profiting. But of course, we've had emancipation now. Slaves are now free. So what do they want to do? They want to get those former slaves right back on their land, working that land, and they want to take the profit from it. And I hope everybody in here knows what the system was that was put in place that replaced slavery. And that system was, of course, sharecropping, right? Now, how were they able to implement sharecropping? How was sharecropping able to become entrenched? Because 100% of every single former slave did not want to go back to work on his former master's land. Every single former slave very much wanted to tell that guy what he thought of him. But yet sharecropping happened. Well, what do farmers want? If you're a poor farmer, and that's really what these people were, what do you want? Land. You want land. Bingo, you want land. Poor farmers want land. Because when you have land, you are free. You see, we can write all the laws on the books saying you can vote, you're a citizen, equality under the law, all of those amendments happen. But pivotal to the American identity is that a free man owns his land. If you go to Thomas Jefferson and say, what gives a man his freedom? He's going to say land. If you go to Andrew Jackson and say, what gives a man his freedom? They're going to say land. A farmer with land is a farmer that lives on his terms. And so the goal was to keep these freedmen, and that's what we can call them now, keep them from getting land. Because if they don't have land, they are forced to go back and work for their former masters as sharecroppers. And it worked. And it worked. The South was given back control. The former slaves didn't get land. And there you go. All the laws on the books can call them equal citizens, but if they don't have land, they are at the mercy of the person they owe money to. They're at the mercy of the man. And that man owns the land. So sharecropping is a way to prevent this. There's a problem here. There is a gigantic fly in the ointment, a very, very big problem that the plantation elite has to deal with. And this is one of the keys that Woodward was able to unlock. You see, ladies and gentlemen, 1/3 of sharecroppers were white. 1 out of 3 sharecroppers were white because the yeoman farmers were devastated by the war. The ordinary Southern citizen, the regular guy, was bankrupted because of the war. And thousands of formerly independent farmers, formerly people who had their 40 acres and their farmhouse and their pigs and chickens, and I'm not rich, but I pay my bills and I'm free because I own my land. Thousands of them lost their land as a result of the war, and that's because the war bankrupted them. The war killed their sons, and without their sons, they can't harvest their crops, so they lose their farms. The war destroyed the value of their land, and if they don't have any value on the land, then they can't pay for it if they owe any debt. They can't pay taxes on the land because they don't make any money, and if you don't pay taxes on your land, what happens? You lose it, right? Anyone who's seen Gone with the Wind knows that's one of the plot points, right? The taxes have to get paid on Terra, and by God, if I'm going to keep the plantation, I got to come up with the money, right? So thousands and thousands of formerly yeoman farmers were forced into sharecropping too. That was the only way they could live. They're forced into sharecropping. So now what do we have? We have a radical restructure of what Southern society looks like. Before we had the planters, then we had the yeomen, then we had the white trash, but most people were yeomen. Now we have an awful lot of very poor whites who are struggling to get by. This is also an era where a fellow by the name of Karl Marx has written a book called The Communist Manifesto. Now, who can tell me what the Communist Manifesto is all about? Who isn't Mr. Baker? What's the new word as a result of Karl Marx? That word is called socialism, ladies and gentlemen. That word is called socialism. And under the tenets of socialism, what happens is you see the poor people, the proletariat, rise up. And what do the proletariat do when they rise up? They take the property from the rich. The elite group of people that own everything, well, we workers are going to come up and we're going to take that. And we're going to redistribute it among ourselves. And everybody will have a small piece of land, and there won't be a rich, there won't be a poor, there'll just be an equal. Now, socialism doesn't end up working, but boy, howdy, was it a popular theory in the 1870s and the 1880s. Political parties all around the world are getting formed around the concept of socialism. Now, are there an awful lot of poor landless people in the South? Yes, there are. And what do those people look like? Well, they look like kind of everybody, don't they? There's poor blacks, there's poor whites. We are now starting to see industry emerge. We are now starting to see industry emerge, and industry starts moving into the South in the 1880s. And with industry comes the call for unions. And a lot of unions were socialist minded. A lot of unions were geared toward the socialist ideology. And there is one of many very important points that Karl Marx makes in the Communist Manifesto, and that is racism is stupid, it makes no sense. There is no logical reason whatsoever to care what color a man's skin is. Workers are workers, folks. That's it. Workers are workers. And the only thing that the owner cares about is you doing the labor. He doesn't care if you're black, white, green, or plaid. All he cares about is your labor. You see? And so, what is the final word, the final sentence in the Communist Manifesto? Working men of the world unite. Working men of the world unite. Here we have, and by the way, the black power, the fist, where do you think that comes from, folks? That comes from the socialist movement in the 1880s. Hey, we need to unite, get together, right? So, what's going to happen? What's going to happen when these people and these people people.
They create anarchy.
Well, to the planners, it's going to be anarchy, right? You know what? Before the war, I was a yeoman and you were a slave, or I was this and you were that, but the war's over, and we're all sitting in exactly the same boat. We are all sitting in exactly the same boat. We are poor farmers with no land, and the planter owns us. He doesn't own us legally, but he darn sure owns us financially. He owns us financially. Well, what are these people going to do? Well, they're going to decide to become friends. They're going to decide to say, you know what, screw race, we're going to work together now. If we do that, we can grant voting rights to the freedmen, right? The former slaves, hey, let's all vote. And they can vote in people who will advocate the cause of the poor at the expense of the rich, right? They can create institutions where everybody gets educated. I don't care what race you are. If you're helping me out and I'm helping you out, that's fine. You see, what Woodward is going to argue is that after the Civil War, there is a tremendous amount of experimentation going on. What exactly is going to happen to the freedmen in this new South that we are building? Are they going to become equal citizens? Are they going to participate in politics? Will they go to school with the whites? What role will they play now that the peculiar institution, that is slavery, is now over? And nobody really knows. Nobody really knows, but a very strong possibility is that the poor whites and the poor blacks form an alliance. They don't concern themselves with race anymore. This becomes a class issue. This becomes a money issue. There's the man with the money, and then there's us workers. Now, if you're the man with the money, you can't let that happen, can you? I can't let the poor whites and the poor blacks become friends. If they become friends, they will form political alliances, and I am in trouble. And wouldn't it be nice, from the perspective of the planet, if we had a built-in mechanism to prevent the poor whites and the poor blacks from becoming friends? Wouldn't it be great if I had a way to draw a wedge in between these two people? And that wedge is segregation. That wedge is the already inherent concept of white supremacy. What we're going to do is convince the poor whites that they are not the same as their black sharecropping counterparts. We're going to draw a wedge in between the two of them. Being white is different and better than being black. The poorest white cracker who never owned a piece of land in his life, and we don't know how many teeth he has because he can't count that high. He is still better than the most educated black man out there. Black man with a PhD, you are still beneath the poor white because race defines your status in society. And if you do that, the whites don't become friends with the blacks. They are separated. When the union comes to town, oh, we don't want those blacks in the union. Can't have them. When the Farmers Alliance comes to town, Farmers Alliance, no, the Grange, oh no, we can't let the black people in the Grange. We're a segregated society. We're a segregated society. This is the natural condition of society, to segregate people. And tragically, of course, it works. Arguing that by unifying the classes will create a loss of jobs for whites, social breakdown, all of the perceived issues with real freedom, arguing that we can't have that worked. And the poor whites went along with it, and we built a segregated society in the 1880s and the 1890s. We built a segregated society where before society was not actually segregated. So, according to Woodward, racial segregation was not about bigotry so much, it was about money. It was about money. It was a way for the people at the top to maintain their wealth and their power over all of the poor people. It was an artificial wedge. An artificial wedge. And that's why King said this is the historic Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. Because you see, Martin Luther King, who is one of the many leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, not the only one, he was the one that wasn't socialist, and so he was the one that everyone was talking about. He would argue very closely, and when you listen to his speeches, what he's going to say is, this is actually a class issue, right? This is a class issue. When you help the poor blacks, what you're really doing is helping everybody, right? When you help one group of people that are in a certain economic class, you're also helping the other people that are in a certain economic class. In reality, what's he saying? We all need to be friends. right? We all need to be on the same team. We need to see that society doesn't need to be broken up by race. Now, of course, later on, that's going to be challenged by black nationalism, right? But that's a whole different issue, right? But Woodward does address that in the 3rd edition, by the way. He talks about how black nationalism is a big monkey wrench thrown into the civil rights movement. But we'll leave that for another lecture. But ultimately, there we go. Ultimately, there we go. You see, here are unions. Here is, of course, the nonsensical segregation, right? We're going to create different bathrooms and different stuff like this, which doesn't mean anything, right? It's all about money, right? It's all about money. What they don't want is this. You see, what the planners don't want is this. We got the black guy, we got the white guy saying, you know what, we can be friends. It's that rich guy that matters, right? When black men start voting, they vote in people that are going to take the wealth away from the wealthy planners. And so we got to find a way to stop the poor whites and let that happen. The first South Carolina legislature after the Civil War had blacks in it. Quite a few, actually. And Louisiana did too, quite a few southern states. And so this is that great experiment period, right? What's going to happen to the freedmen? Well, they're perfectly capable of moving up. But unfortunately, segregation put the brakes on that. Blame it on the poor whites for taking the bait, I suppose. I don't know. All right, any questions? Any questions? Yep.
So, it wasn't about equality.
It was about money.
That's what I'm saying, but was it the fact that if they all ran the race equally, the money wouldn't be dispersed? Like,
Well, the idea was the money would be more dispersed among
That's
the
what
working classes. You see what I'm saying? It would be, we would make an argument where when there's wealth inequality, when a tremendous amount of wealth is held at the top and very little is held at the bottom, well, obviously, if these groups get together, they're going to push for policies that send more wealth to them. You see what I'm saying?
yes.
And so, if you're at the top, you can't let that happen. I have to find a way to stop them from becoming friends. I have to find a way to stop them from working together, right? You get what I'm saying? And so that's, yeah, at the end of the day, somebody's trying to preserve their bottom line. Somebody's trying to preserve it. Does the planter after the Civil War care what color his sharecroppers are? No, he doesn't. As long as you're working my fields, I don't care what you look like, right? But when those sharecroppers decide we're going to be friends and unify against mistreatment, that's when he freaks out. See?
Okay.
And the white sharecroppers and black sharecroppers were sitting in the same boat, weren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, they weren't. Sitting in the same boat. And so we can't let them figure out that they're sitting in the same boat. We can't let them see what's really going on. And so it's in the interest of the rich to maintain segregation. Yeah.
So that's what created white privilege?
And we would call it white privilege, right? Or I would call it second-class citizens for blacks, right? But the concept of white privilege, yes, even the poorest white is still quote-unquote better than the better off black. And of course, Woodward looked at that and said, there's no sense to that. That makes absolutely no sense in any logical way. But it's a way to pander to the poor whites and throw them a bone, so to speak, and stop them from embracing socialism, stop them from embracing unions, stop them from embracing programs that would actually benefit them.
And like you said, it did actually work.
It
So
worked.
did.
Well, it worked until Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement, so on and so forth, yes. It worked for a long time. And that's the tragic part. And what he points out in the 1950s is it's now finally breaking down. You know, and this is 1954. And in the original first edition of Strange Career, he says it's 1954 and we're now seeing a breakdown of racial segregation, which should, you know, again, it never had to be there to begin with. And he's saying, what's next? Right? What's going to happen next now that racial segregation breaks down? Are the wealthy elites going to try to find some other way to separate the workers? What you need to notice, and I don't know if anyone here has, unions in the South are very, very, very unrepresented. The South does not like unions. The South hates unions, right? But unions are designed to help the working man, right? And so why would poor white people in the South hate unions? You see what I mean? Now, I'm not saying unions are good or bad. I'm not trying to convince you politics, but these are people that are acting against their own economic self-interest.
Are you saying right now, or are you talking about doing that?
Well, historically.
Okay.
Throughout the 20th century.
Now,
Throughout
I'm
the
gonna
20th
say
century.
historically, they saying it was built.
You know,
it was set up.
unions still are unpopular in the South.
Yeah, they're very unpopular in the South.
You know?
But you would think that the poorest region of the country with the most quote unquote, people that could benefit from an increase in wages and things like that, you think they want unions, right? Well, the traditional anti-union stance in the South stems from the idea that if you white workers push for unions, you gotta let the blacks in too. You see? And so it's a racist argument, yeah.
Is there any parallel that you see between that notion of the wedge being created between poor whites that took foothold in the elections of 45?
I was about to ask that same question.
The elections of 1945?
Number 45.
Of number 45.
Oh, number 45. I get it. If anybody thinks that race didn't play a role in that, I got a bridge to sell you, right?
Yeah.
I think that there's definitely some of that going on. It's very difficult to say, right? It's very difficult to say.
I guess my point is
Is it though?
to demonstrate to working poor whites that they are not what they are being portrayed to be.
Right.
And I think that you're absolutely right.
It's
on
more of
that.
it's more of a class and economic argument than it is. They're still caught up in the notion that I can't be.
They are still caught up in that segregation notion. They are absolutely still caught up in it. That is absolutely right. I think that there's a shadow of it. It's still, the ghost of Jim Crow is still definitely here. The ghost of Jim Crow is still definitely, in the minds of white working class. Absolutely.
I have a comment and a question. All right, one, the comment and the question. I know you read Dark Journey.
Oh yeah,
Macmillan.
Macmillan.
And Macmillan makes the point that white planners are going to say, we have no problem with black people. They really didn't, because most of them, the rich ones, they were nursed by black people. Their black servants were the ones who were their friends. They, grew up with them. Most were raised, those planners' sons were raised by black men and women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they make this point that you have to have some segregation, because they're going to say, after you release them, it's the poor whites who are going to be the ones that will lynch them and do all these things.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have no problem with them. We're good with them. We're most of them are going to, list even in their will that they're black and give them land. I think about in South Carolina, one of the black codes, you could not give away your child to a black person, because they didn't want to give their child, if something happened to them, they want to give their child to a white relative. They want to give their child in the care of someone who raised them.
And that would happen very frequently.
Yeah.
They would prefer that, and so it was written into law. Yeah, that was one of the weird laws. Yeah.
So my question is this going on even before slavery is out? Are they thinking about this wedge between?
I would think not. I would think not. I would think if we were to ask Woodward, he would probably say no. And the reason is because this is a great era of experimentation.
Okay.
Remember, after the war ends, nobody knows what's going to happen next. And so I don't think that the planter class was thinking about this before. And we also have to keep in mind, the planter class thought slavery was never going to end.
Well, what is I doing in the Civil War? Because I'm bringing it up. I'm from Jefferson County, right? From Ellisville. I lived in Ellisville, about 2 years ago for a while, and that's where you get Newt Knight.
Yeah.
And Newt Knight is drafted into the Civil War by the Confederates, and his mindset is like, hey, we don't own slaves, we shouldn't be in this, and he very much trying his best during the war to bring people together, try to convince them of that.
I think during the war, there's definitely some of that. I think that during the war, they're already thinking about that. When it becomes obvious they're going to lose, clearly, when it becomes obvious they're going to lose, I don't think there's any question that they're already putting it in their minds. Those poor whites are going to become friends with the former slaves. They already know it. They know those poor whites are going to turn to those former slaves and realize we're friends. Yeah. I don't think any question during the war. Yeah.
Awesome. Great job.
I appreciate it. Yeah. I love talking about, again, the stuff that is a little bit out of my lane, because this is the kind of stuff that I studied years ago, so I find it fascinating. The real takeaway that Woodward would absolutely insist on is that the years after the Civil War did not have to see things play out as they did.
Wow.
This was a period of experimentation. If a different set of circumstances had happened, we might have never seen segregation. We might have seen a radically different restructure of Southern society. And the civil rights movement, as we understand it, would simply be identified with the Civil War amendments. Because after that, everyone would have more or less been equal. The power of the planter class would have genuinely been broken, and then that would have opened the door for actual equality and land ownership among the former slaves. And that would have put the South in an entirely different lane. It's, go back in time and change that one little thing. And we would have seen, now again, we would have still seen a whole bunch of poor farmers, right? As everybody was, but we would have not seen sharecropping. We would have not seen sharecropping. And if you don't see sharecropping, you see black land ownership. If you see black land ownership, you see equality. And that gets back down to the
And
economic.
generational wealth.
Yeah, generational wealth. And that is a huge thing. That's a huge thing. You'll recall, I don't know, again, I don't know how much you discussed it, but Booker T. Washington was arguing the economic argument,
That's my
right? He did not say challenge the legal Jim Crow laws. He said we need black land ownership, we need black skilled education, and if this class of citizens becomes economically well off and away from their sharecropper status, equality will come naturally. You know, he said this is all about the money. Become economically independent, the heck with the Jim Crow laws. Yeah, you call a man with the money, sir, you know.
So basically, they did do like what Jane Elliott was talking about, like a brown eye, blue eye experiment, and it just went too far. Like seriously,
It did,
that's
it
what
did.
it sounded like. It
Yeah,
sounded like they played an experiment, and it just took off with it.
Yeah, the brown eye, blue eye, I remember that in the room where they put them in different rooms.
And it seemed
And-
like
and-
that
and you
really
saw-
took a hold.
And you saw that when they
Yeah,
started
easily.
segregating the room by brown eyes and blue eyes, the blue-eyed people started becoming
That's what I'm saying.
bigoted toward the brown-eyed people. And even in advance, they knew that this was just a game, and it still happened.
That's
Even
what
when
I'm
they knew in
saying.
advance this was a game, it still happened.
So,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, I'm
Go
just
ahead.
saying that it was
Yeah.
an experiment, but it really like took off. Like it took a life of its own.
My question, and great job, Lester.
Oh,
My
thank you.
question is because this is a good segue, because Monday we're gonna talk about W.E. Boys and Booker T. Washington.
Yeah.
So my question, before we get there, is Booker T. right? Do you think that would have worked?
No.
Okay.
Um,
Because I'm agreeing with you, I don't think it would have worked.
I don't think it would work.
I don't think it would
I
work.
think that he is motivated by noble means.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I really do believe that he's motivated by noble means. The problem is you're never going to have black economic equality until blacks can vote.
That's right.
You see, the real way to preserve Jim Crow was keep them from voting. If you look at the Civil
Yeah.
Rights Movement, there's a reason why the Voting Rights Act was the last thing passed. And if you look at the real fight, I mean, if we were to go to the civil rights leaders, you know, we'll say the 40s or 50s, and say, you can have one thing. If there's one thing and all you get is one thing, what's it going to be? They would say voting. And so Du Bois says we have to fight for those political rights. We have to get to the ballot box. And so I'm more on Du Bois.
That's why he's on my door. That's my door, he's on my
Yeah.
door. That's why he's there.
Yeah. And of course, why is Du Bois not talked about all that much in American history classes? It's communist.
He was communist.
Yeah, it's communist.
Yeah.
Can't have communists.
Loud communist.
Oh, unapologetic.
Yeah.
We're out of time, by the way.
Hey, man, awesome.
Thank y'all for coming. I really appreciate it. I will see you again in a few weeks and talk about something else.
Yeah, thank you so much. Everybody online, I think I got you. Who I think that's Terry. Terry, I have you. Everybody's online, I have you. Marcus, good to see you. Diamond, Dwayne, I have a good one. You guys are
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'll talk to you soon.
That's great. That was